There is a wealth and financial gap in America, and far too often, race is the overriding factor. In fact, racial identity plays a huge role in individuals' financial prosperity. According to the Center for American Progress, Black Americans own approximately 1/10 of the wealth of white Americans. A Washington Post column titled, "I'm a Black Woman Writing About Money and Race, Here's What I See," covers some of the adversities Black Americans may face with their personal finances, while also looking at how non-Black Americans respond to some of these claims. So joining me now from the Washington Post is Michelle Singletary, a personal finance columnist and author of Sincerely Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us. So, what is interesting about your column here is you're essentially writing about the reaction that you get when you wade into these waters. You come from, a finance background where it's supposed to be about black and white on the paper, ink and paper, and spreadsheets and balances, and there should be no emotion, no bias that comes into play, but that's not the reality in this country. And so you felt compelled to write about this at times, to write about the biases within financial institutions, and sometimes people don't want to hear it. So before we get into some of the reactions that you have received and how you've kind of like digested that and what you've come out with on the other end, I want to talk about some of the topics that you have brought up in your columns. Predatory lending, discriminatory lending practices. You've been writing about this stuff for like 20 years and it hasn't changed. But a lot of people, I think, don't understand what you mean when you say predatory and discriminatory lending practices.
That's right. It's a 10-part series covering from even how I was treated as the affirmative action hire, to predatory lending, to redlining, to investing, all the topics. And I wanted to dispel a lot of the myths as it relates to African Americans. And so, for example, we may have lower credit scores than whites when you look at it just in black and white, as you point out. But when you look behind the scenes, when you look at the reason, the context, putting history in perspective, when there was redlining, when blacks were not allowed to buy a home, and having a home loan is a major part of the credit scoring system. So if you weren't allowed to buy a home, or when you bought a home you had to pay more, then that may impact your credit score, and that is a direct line to systemic racism. It's the same with all kinds of other issues, and that's what I wanted to sort of say. Let's put this stuff in perspective, people, so that you don't just sort of think that blacks are less than, when in fact there were systemic structural things in place that kept us from acquiring the same wealth that you have.
Right, and I think that, for some people, they think, oh, I've heard of redlining, but that was back then. And they still don't understand that, being held back then continues to echo, not just for a few years, not just for decades, but for generations. People trying to catch up. What I thought was so fascinating about your writing in this one particular column is you talk about the pushback, particularly the discomfort with pointing out microaggressions. Right? They seem so little, and calling them microaggressions sounds so little, but they can have such a powerful impact. And I think when you see the pushback that you get, that gives you a sense of that even those who are pushing back against it know that these are very impactful tools. Can you talk a little bit about some of the responses that you've received when you pointed out, how microaggressions can grow into big problems for black people, for minorities in this country?
Yeah, so I wrote a column about this thing that, even when you do all the things that you're supposed to do, my husband and I have done what we're supposed to do. We went to college. We have advanced degrees. We got married and then had our children. We saved. And yet when we show up at places, it's as if we are a foreigner in our own land. And I gave a couple of examples of microaggression. This is sort of little slights. So my husband and I was at a theater, a play, interracial cast of Oklahoma, loved the theater. And so this woman came, she was sitting behind me. We had front row seats. She said, she came down and she said, you know, how did you get these seats? You must know somebody in the play. And I'm looking at this woman like, okay, I'm going to say what I said in the column. I said, I bought my tickets just, I didn't say this to her in my head. I was like, have I bought my ticket just like you bought your ticket? Why would you assume that I couldn't afford these premium seats? Now, there were white people sitting on both sides of me. She didn't ask them how they got their tickets. And my husband,
right,
who often is playing with my children, this white guy went up to him. It's like, I'm so proud of you playing with your children. He walked past other white fathers to get to my black husband to basically say, I'm proud that you're not proving that stereotype wrong, that you leave your children. And so when you recount these, people sort of think, oh, you're overreacting, you're too sensitive. But when you get a lifetime of this, there's always this questioning. Why are you here? How did you get to this 5-star resort? What do you do for a living? I don't know you. Why are you asking me how I got to this 5-star resort? You didn't ask the couple sitting next to me who is white. I was in the TSA line, and this white guy asked me, oh, you must be in the wrong line. Well, why would you think I'm in the wrong line? I pay for TSA just like you pay for TSA. Those are the kinds of things that happen that just make you feel like you are not you're not an American, that you are not doing the normal everyday things that other Americans do simply because you're black.
Right, and these are the sort of things that sort of chip away at you. And when it comes to personal finance, which is sort of your expertise, you see it in the business world as well, whether it means, a bank asking for a few more pieces of documentation before approving a loan, or approving a loan at a higher interest rate, maybe just a little bit higher, but these things have a concrete impact on black folks' ability to build wealth moving forward.
That's exactly right. There's still discrimination in lending, and people think, well, how could that be? Credit scores don't put down your race. You're not identified by your race. But when you show up at the dealership, they know that you may be feeling a little insecure about your credit score, and they take advantage of that, which is why I encourage people to know your finances so that people don't take advantage of you. This has happened to me time and time again. I'm trying to buy a car. I buy cars with cash now, but back in the day, this guy told me, was trying to offer me an interest rate that was like 3 times the going rate. And I had already been approved for a below rate because I have great credit. And he said, well, it must be something wrong with your credit score. I was like, and my husband was sitting next to me, and he put his arm across my chest because I was going to hop over that desk and slap that man. I know what my credit score is, but he was trying to take advantage because I was African American and a woman. Yeah. And they do that, and there have been lawsuits that show that they do charge black folks more than they do whites. And now I know you're probably listening thinking, well, they should know better. But no, we should not have to fight against this continued racism that is in place in the lending industry.
So, a couple of things that you mentioned, I know exactly, because I've been in similar situations where I've gotten jobs and people have asked me, well, you must be connected. How, who got you this job? It's just, in fact, just the other day, I wrote on social media that people should consider, in buying their holiday gifts, supporting black and minority businesses because it's a really tough time. And somebody called me racist for writing that. And the conclusion that I came to, and I began to write back this long thing, what you don't realize is about the systemic, racism and the difficulty in establishing a business and keeping, and then I was like, no, because this is, decades of history, and I'm not a history teacher. But
you know what? I
recognize that
person. So, because that's what one of the researchers I talked to is that we tend to not want to engage people when they say and do things like that because we don't want to talk about race all the time. It is risky to talk about race, but you should go back and send that tweet. And I have decided, and this is why I did those columns, I am no longer going to stay silent because we have to put these things in historical perspective. They don't want to talk about slavery as still impacting the finances of Black Americans, but it still does. And I'm just going to still talk about it so that we can address it.
What I found interesting about your column is you also identified the larger group of people who wrote to you and said thank you. I didn't realize when I said it's so nice to see you playing with your children that what I was doing was inappropriate. I didn't realize the subtext. You know, and it's like you've been shedding a light not on these issues, not only for black people, not only for white people, but also black people too. And you notice something, that change can happen. What is kind of your biggest takeaway from your experience of writing about race and finance?
Yeah, so I got the notes that said we should still be in Africa in mud huts, and that, blacks are just not good people. I got all that racist stuff, but I got more letters and emails from people who said, I did not know that this is what I was doing. And that provided so much encouragement to me that I was able to open up people's eyes to what it's like to be a Black American. And I applaud them, and it just lifted my spirits to know that some people really do want to know how to be a better person and how to treat Black Americans better. And they received what I had to say. And that was so encouraging to me. And they drowned out the bigots. And I didn't know if that was possible, but they did. And I'm so appreciative of the many white folks who wrote, who said, I didn't know when I said that was how it had made you feel. And I'm just encouraged that if we listen, if we just stop and not try to just immediately respond to something that I say as defensive. When I wrote about reparations, there were so many people who were so defensive about it. I didn't own slaves. Well, America profited from all this free labor, and therefore you were able to advance financially because of all this Black free labor. And people were like, you know what? I hadn't seen that way, that slavery was theft. It stole the ability of Black Americans to succeed. And I'm glad that you pointed that out.
Well, Michelle Singletary, knowledge is power, so you keep sharing that knowledge, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. So glad to be here.